Part 10. Book quote reading from my Zen Mind balcony. This is the first episode looking into what autism really is. In this episode, I go into the different ways of communication autistics use in comparison to neurotypicals. Let's get into it.
Kind of feel maybe I'm not stupid because you see all these clever moments, but you see your behavior so weird and your functioning so patchy, you're not convinced that you could ever be, in an ongoing way, a particularly functional person. But I guess slowly you learn, hopefully, that you are in there and that you have got all that capacity. And it's a matter of a bag of tricks to try to stop all the sabotage. The skill for me is being able to functionally navigate that dream state in ways that facilitate it letting out brilliance. Autism is a fruit salad. Everyone's fruit salad is different. If you want to be empowered, you need to work out your own fruit salad and what makes each of those parts tick and what are their best strategies and adaptations. And that will give you advocacy for those things. Instead of saying, oh, it's all my autism, let's dissect it and say it's this part of my autism, it's this part, it's that part, and they've got their own little names. And yeah, because otherwise we expect everyone to be one size fits all, and we're not. For me, and everyone's, like if you say, tell us about stimming, tell us about this, every person's reason is coming from their fruit salad. So when you say about pronouns, my reasons will come from my fruit salad, Barb's reasons will come from her fruit salad, so I can talk about what's coming from mine. But as an autism consultant who worked with over 1,000 people with autism, I can also say I've seen other reasons why it will come out in other people. In my case, there were a number of things going on. The inability to process a simultaneous sense of self and other. This means that when you get other, you lose self. You still record everything they're saying, but you can't work out what you think or feel about any of it. And then when you get into self, you lose track of other. They're an impression, they're doing stuff, but it means nothing. And it's not in relation to you, even if they think it is. They're disappeared. You can only process this or this. But it's such an essential thing in the non-autistic world. So essential and so automatic and so easy that they have this I and you thing. And me in relation to you. And, you know, when you this, then I feel that. That's all language of simultaneous processing of self and other. I didn't achieve that till I was 35 years old. Each piece that goes in your fruit salad compounds the degree of what presents as your autism. And so, and that can be for good or bad. It can be, for example, that being extremely meaning deaf makes you a fabulous musician. It may be that being face blind makes you a great sculptor. It may be that seeing your world in bits makes you enormously sensory because you tune into the part because the whole does not exist. I wrote a book called Autism and Sensing, The Unlost Instinct, and that's the one about unknown knowing and being able to trigger stuff from unknown knowing out in order for the conscious mind to be able to perceive it. And then there's books like Autism and Inside Out Approach, which is how to make your environment easier to process so that you're not shutting down all the time. How to make your environment easier to process so you can actually process you and another person at the same time without getting them, losing you, getting you, losing them, blah, blah.
Gestalt perception can account for both strengths and weaknesses in autistic people's perception. On the one hand, this amount of unselected information cannot be processed simultaneously and may lead to sensory information overload. fragmented perception, delayed processing, distortions, monoprocessing, peripheral perception, and so forth. Donna describes how this feels from the inside. Without developing the capacity to filter out a large amount of incoming sensory information, our conscious minds would be confused and overwhelmed, our perception fragmented, our senses overloaded, and perhaps heightened as the mind focused even more intensely on what was coming in a futile attempt to combat the confusion, emotions, unprocessed, undefined, and all-muddled, may terrify us. People, as a major source of ever-changing sensory input, may become a source of threatening overload we'd learn to seek to avoid. Williams, 1998, page 82. We feel safe in an environment that gives out the appropriate cues, and we like people who give us cues that make us feel good. Physically, our sympathetic nervous system is soothed by safe cues from people. At a subliminal, physical level, our need for these positive cues has to be met. We know who we are and we feel safe when we feel well met. When we do not receive them, we can feel unsafe. When people don't give us these cues, we can feel betrayed, insulted, threatened, unloved, and uncared for, because we need them in order to feel secure at a subliminal level. We can feel disengaged and emotionally disconnected from the person without them, and we can go into our own heightened state of fight, flight, and freeze. Let's see what Tony Atwood has to say about this.
I was a 19-year-old psychology student, just on my first year, and went to be a volunteer at a special school. This is way back in 1971, when we knew very little about autism, and I had never heard anything about it. And it was at that special school I met two severely or classically autistic individuals, Sarah, who was 5, and Russell, who was 7. And I was, I suppose, enchanted by many aspects of two children who looked like any other kids. But it was almost as though they came from another planet, in the sense that what other kids would enjoy, socializing, change, spontaneity, they hated. Yet things that other kids would find boring, playing with water for about 5 hours, they really thoroughly enjoyed. And when I tried to connect, there was a difficulty in connecting both ways. But it was from that day I decided to take a career in autism and discovered whatever I could from then on. And of course, that was at the beginning, when autism was the silent, aloof, severely disabled, poor prognosis person. And I was there right at the beginning to discover that it was a continuum, like visual impairment. You can have those who are blind, very obvious, but technically I am visually impaired. I need my glasses. So I'm visually impaired, but I'm not blind. And as we explored the continuum, we found those who were blind to the social world in a way and needed help and guidance in that area. That's how I began professionally, and then chose to do a PhD and so on. But I also, later on, as I was, in many ways, within the family, my mother, I would phone every Sunday. And it was one Sunday about 5 or 6 years ago when I was talking to her and she said, "Anthony, I've just read an article on Asperger's syndrome." I said, "Yes, Mother." And she said, "Your stepfather, Bernard, whom she married when I was 6 years old, engineer," she said, "He's Asperger's syndrome." And I said, "Yes, Mother, don't you actually read my books?" And And yes, and so, in other words, when I was 6 years old and she married Bernard, I became aware of difference in a particular dimension. And indeed, yes, Asperger's syndrome was the description of why he was different. So I see myself as bilingual. I was brought up in an Aspie household. And so my bilingual characteristics began at the age of 6. What I've also discovered is a history of Asperger's in my extended family that we didn't know at the time. So I say there are some people who are pre-wired neurologically to have Asperger's, and there are some who are pre-wired to understand it. And that's what happened. And my daughter works with kids with autism, but I never taught her anything, and she just knows what to do. So my story is one of a journey of discovery, recognizing this professionally, but then within the family. So my knowledge isn't just primarily academic or clinical. Of course, I have a son with Asperger's syndrome.
We're sort of learning more and more about Asperger's and autism. And I suppose from your perspective, because you have been in the game for so long, you have been really involved in it so intensely, from your home perspective and from your clinical perspective, how has our understanding of autism changed over the years, and how do you think it will continue to change over the next 20 years or so?
We then recognize that it's a neurodevelopmental condition. Whether it's a disorder is currently under review. And in England, it's now called autism spectrum conditions rather than disorder, because disorder implies a psychiatric disability. And I'm a bit cautious of labeling people disordered disability when in many ways they have talents that we need. So we recognize that the brain is wired differently and not necessarily defectively. My own description of ASD is it describes someone who has a different way of perceiving, thinking, learning, and relating. But it's a minority in a world of social zealots. And those with Asperger's have found in life something more interesting than socializing. But they have to socialize, especially at school. I think as the changes occurred, we've recognized that the difficulties the person has with socializing are qualities that can be taught. We didn't know that to begin with.
Sensory differences in ASD. It has become increasingly clear that sensory differences play a central role in the experience of autism for many people with ASD. Both scientific research and first-hand accounts have shown that sensory issues manifest in numerous ways in the lives of people with ASD, and these issues have consequences for their daily lives. There are also numerous studies and books providing statistics on the numbers of people with ASD who have sensory differences, with, for example, Mays and Colloon in 1999 reporting that 100% of the participants in their study showed sensory difficulties across various sensory categories. We assume that language is necessarily verbal, i.e. comprising of words. That is why we say that children are verbal if they can talk, no matter that their verbal output is just a combination of echolalic phrases, and that they are nonverbal if they cannot produce verbal output. Donna Williams brilliantly illustrates this misleading conclusion with a story about a talking parrot. People buy a parrot and they think that they teach it to speak. In spite of teaching, the parrot learns maybe he is bored out of his mind or learns he gets rewarded for performing. The people are impressed because they now have a clever parrot. Their parrot can do things. An expert comes along and says the parrot only appears to speak. But the parrot did have language. Beyond cheap tricks, the parrot has always had language. It had and always will have its own. What language are they speaking? I turned to see Cass crying. I never thought he had any language, she said. Now I see he does. I just don't know how to speak it. We think it is we who have to teach autistic people. Now I see it is us who have so much to learn from them. I tried to grasp the Millers' efforts. They tried equally hard to come to grips with mine. They were coming from a foreign place and speaking a foreign language just like I was. I began to see that given how totally different our underlying systems were, it was a miracle that we bothered at all. Some autistic individuals acquire a system of symbols later in life as a secondary, not dominant primary language. Some remain monolingual with a sensory-based system. This is in contrast with monolingualism in non-autistic individuals, which is based on verbal symbolic system of functioning. We learn to form concepts. The information that does not fit the concepts is screened out, irrelevant. With the appearance of language and the development of vocabulary, the conceptual system changes. In normal development, the dominant side of interpretation and later on communication and thinking is a verbal, symbolic one, whereas in autism we may observe sensory-based thinking, or at least a later transition of dominance from sensory to verbal, symbolic plane of comprehension. Very few individuals remain fluent in both languages. For instance, Donna Williams, a woman with high-functioning autism, has become bilingual in acquiring and becoming reasonably able to use both systems. In my case, I remember this transition from the system of sensing into the system of interpretation began to happen not in the first days or weeks of life as usual, but at around 3 years old. It was not until around the age of 10 that the system of interpretation with much begrudgment eventually came to be relied upon rather than merely put up with or tuned out. Even then, it was taken on not as a first or primary language, but as a secondary one, and much later as one of two equal but different primary systems. Williams, 1998, page 79. When the child does start to talk, her speech is characterized with specific autistic features, as if the child was speaking a foreign language. Autistic children seem to acquire language intellectually as an adult would have to learn, say, Russian or Japanese. Before we start discussing peculiarities of verbal behavior exhibited by autistic children, I'd like to remind you about a very important point which is briefly summarized by O'Neill. Language has a different usage for an autistic person than it has for a non-autistic person. We take the ability to speak for granted and often erroneously assume that a child who is mute either is being deliberately rude or indifferent to others. Autistic children do not plan whether to talk or not to talk. They do not speak because they either are unable to speak or do not understand what it is all about, and not because they do not want to communicate with us. In many cases, they are too overwhelmed to speak. It is our task to decrease the stress by making the environment more communication-friendly and adjusting our interactive style to theirs. Although we do have to try to teach autistic children verbal language, a shared means of communication, talking should never be forced on them. To find a shared way to communicate with the nonverbal child is of paramount importance.
Yes, when I speak, sometimes it doesn't come out right, or Chip has trouble understanding me, and then it comes out wrong, and then you have to try to explain it. Yeah, it's been an interesting awakening for me, coming to terms with the autistic thing and then getting in autistic groups and finding out just how many people have communication issues. Like, there's just so many.
This wasn't just to do with how I understood verbal language, but also how I understood both visual language and the visual impression of objects and people. When I heard people speaking, I assumed they were mostly just making noise patterns. The speech of others was like a mosaic of tumbled sound, some patterned, some not, some was rhythm, some not, some was strange and interesting sound combinations. People's facial expressions seemed idiosyncratic contortions. As faces, they were so very hard to recognize, because they never remained constant. Objects were known mostly by their placement, movement, acoustics, or texture. Visually, it depended on which angle you came at them. They seemed ever-changing, and visual recognition was always so delayed that other means of ascertaining the use of familiarity of something was much more immediate. Donna Williams, 203, page 62-63. Repeating things other people say helps to clarify the meaning in an autistic person's mind, as it aids the cognitive process. An autistic child will repeat a question someone asks her to be able to hear the words in her own voice, to take an external stimulus inward, accept it, and prepare a reply. For example, Donna Williams states that she could comprehend only about 5 to 10% of what was said to her unless she repeated it to herself. Immediate echolalia, in this case, is a strategy to translate verbal words into meaningful inner language, whether visual, kinesthetic, or olfactory. Thus, while repeating the sentence, either loudly or silently, silent echolalia, they elicit pictures, tactile, olfactory images, whatever their inner language is, in the mind. It is a kind of reverse thinking. Using this strategy, they gradually can develop skills to speak meaningfully without any noticeable delay. However, acquiring these immediate translation skills sometimes takes years and a lot of practice. Echolalia can be interpreted as a request. For instance, when a child wants a biscuit, he says, "Do you want a biscuit?" Autistic children appear to learn the language even without any understanding that language is a tool for communication. Through the rote learning of echolalic patterns, their first speech may be meaningless repetitions of television jingles, songs, nursery rhymes, etc. Sometimes 99% of their verbal repertoire is a stored-up collection of literal dictionary definitions and stock phrases. Some autistic adults use the strategies to understand what they are told better. Paradoxically, we often interpret these attempts at translation as bizarre autistic behaviors and prevent them from learning. Of course, with the best intentions. Stop fidgeting, stand still and listen to what I am telling you. What they say about mime signing, I personally prefer mime to use spoken language alone. It is less physically exhausting for me and I feel better connected to drawing my words through my hands than connecting to something so far removed and abstract as a collection of throat and lung exercises that are called speech. I have basically little trust of speech. I always keep checking to see whether I'm being understood. I can't actually see how other people can interpret the meaning of these sounds. With sign, I can see they have seen my meaning, and I trust that more and can keep better track of my own expression. Many autistic individuals, even without having been taught, use mime signs. They are not always conventional signs. Some autistic individuals with kinesthetic language use signs as a supportive means for translating verbal words, both receptive and expressive, as they often make better sense of what has been said through the movements. Thus, when they listen or speak, they might aid their understanding and expression by using physical or mental signs in order to make better connections. For autistic children with kinesthetic inner language, verbal language can be taught through action songs and rhymes. When used as one simple single action per word, mimes can make linear sentences. Another advantage of using mime is that it is much more easily understood by non-autistic people, so it can be used in a wider variety of environments than conventional sign language. Kinesthetic language helps the child to make connections between spoken words and body reactions. It is a sort of body mapping. Tactile language. If visual, auditory and kinesthetic systems do not work for a child, tactile language could be tried. For some children, those with severe sensory perceptual problems and who are usually nonverbal, touch is often the most reliable sense. They often find it easier to recognize objects through feel. In this case, a tactile system should be favored. Children can be taught to read by giving them plastic or wooden letters to feel. They can learn about many activities by feeling objects involved in these activities. To make their life more predictable, you may give them some objects to feel in advance to prepare them for future events. For example, a spoon or a plate before a meal, a towel before bath time, etc. If you teach the child the names of some objects, give him these objects to feel, or smell or tap to produce a sound. Use his language to translate the meaning of the word. Even those with dominant visual or auditory systems often benefit from having tactile messages introduced during stressful or unfamiliar situations. What they say. Even though the sense of touch is often compromised by excessive sensitivity, it can sometimes provide the most reliable information about the environment for people with autism. What we can do to help? Whatever language the child speaks, comment on what your child is doing, feeling, seeing, hearing. It will help the child to connect the word with this internal image, to wrap up the sensory-based word into a verbal envelope. Written communication. And the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be, or if you'd like to put more simply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others, that what you were or might have been was not otherwise than what you had would have appeared to them to be otherwise. "I think I should understand that better," Alice said, very politely, "if I had it written down." These are so-called non-verbal or pre-verbal ways of knowing about the self and environment. They may be seen as sensory abstractions, non-verbal thoughts, which are still not sufficiently understood or appreciated. According to Winnicott, this is the basis of the true self-experience, which derives directly from the world as experienced and has its origins in the earliest sensations. Sensory knowing starts with recognition of patterns, and they are less accessible to conscious verbal rational thought. People involved just visit a different sensory perceptual world as tourists visiting a different culture while maintaining their own. However, there are people who are born and grown up in different perceptual worlds, for whom the different language-less world of being-isness is home. For autistic individuals, for example, this unconceptualized world is the one they were born into. Some can develop abilities to leave it, even if temporarily, to visit the world of the majority. But some never get a visa to cross the border, and they stay in their world most of their lives. It had been the same as long as I had known. Some things hadn't changed since I was an infant, swept up in the perception of swirling air particles, a child lost in repetition of a pattern of sound, or a teenager staring for hours at colored billiard balls, trying to grasp the experience of the particular color I was climbing into. While individuals with ASD can be socially offline, they still can have much deeper subconscious emotional connections with people with whom they have a very strong bond. Carers often report that their children or clients feel calm if they themselves are calm, and agitated if the carer feels nervous. Working with families with autistic children, I have met mothers who confided that they believe their offspring can read their emotional states, even when there are miles between them. Unfortunately, but understandably, very few of them are prepared to talk about it publicly. I've always known that my son reacts to my emotional states, and I do my best to compose myself and feel good when we are together, but now I suspect that even when I am far away, our special emotional connection is always there. This issue has been investigated by Temple Grandin in her acclaimed co-authored book Animals in Translation, using the mysteries of autism to decode animal behavior. As people with autism are mostly perceptual thinkers, it is no wonder that some of them can understand the non-verbal behaviors of animals. Grandin speculates that autistic people's frontal lobes almost never work as well as normal people's do, so our brain function ends up being somewhere in between human and animal. We use our animal brains more than normal people do, because we have to. We don't have a choice. Autistic people are closer to animals than normal people are. According to Gurney, the main factor in animal communication is the ability to listen, which means to become tuned or more sensitive, and it is possible to learn how to use our intuition to allow ourselves to really feel as the animals feel. This ability is natural to young children, but as we grow older and become intellectually oriented, this ability is suppressed. Intuition is like a muscle that needs exercise. Another interesting observation is that animals are very much a reflection of us. They reflect, resonate with our emotions and inner feelings. Often humans just do not listen to them. They ignore the messages their pets are sending them. That is why many of the pets have learned to communicate to their owners by other means. Just as our normal perception interferes with our understanding of other possible sensory experiences, our verbal language imposes normal established categories, thus hindering our comprehension of other possible interpretations. Here we may distinguish several sensory-based languages. 1. Visual language. Individuals use visual images. 2. Tactile language. Individuals recognize things by touching them, feeling textures and surfaces with their hands, bare feet, or their cheeks. Through touch, they acquire information about the size and shape of things, but not about their function or purpose. They store the information for later reference and may find similar objects, e.g. a plastic ball and a rubber ball, to be completely different words in their vocabulary because they feel different. Kinesthetic language. Individuals learn about things and events through the physical movements of their body. Each thing or activity is identified by certain pattern of body movement. They know places and distances by the amount and pattern of the movement. Auditory language. Individuals remember objects and events by sound pictures. If the object is silent, they may tap it to recognize it by the sound it produces. 5. Smell language. Objects and people are identified by smell. 6. Taste language. Individuals may lick objects and people to feel the taste they give on the tongue. Nonverbal people are masters at reading slight differences in a teacher's or parent's actions. I had one parent tell me the child has extrasensory perception because he is already waiting at the door before his mother even gets her car keys or purse. It is likely that the individual is sensing slight differences in behavior before it's time to get the keys or purse. There may be some hustle and bustle activities, such as throwing out the newspaper. The child may be responding to the sound of the paper being crushed in the trash can. Autistic individuals, especially those at the so-called nonverbal low-functioning end of the spectrum, who rely on their system of sensing, are more aware of the details that average normal people have been missing. These individuals get much more accurate nonverbal information than others because they tune in their environment and listen to the intuition and not to the intellect that might interpret the opposite to the way they feel. They use what Donna calls the system of sensing. as opposed to conventional verbal and nonverbal interpretation. The basic feel or edges of the interaction that would take place, I could tell from the incongruence between what was being portrayed and what I could sense, whether chaos was impending or fear and reactiveness in the air. I wasn't psychic in the common media sense of the word. It was merely that my system was quicker, less mechanical, less plodding than the system of interpretation. Yeah, I think this is very natural, and possibly all those so-called primitive tribes, they still have that sense, because this is survival skill. When you sense the environment, you know there is danger in the air, you feel it. But we have lost it in our so-called civilization. Some individuals have developed the skills to interpret these messages and trained themselves to become mind readers, magicians, or even psychics. They learn how to tune in to their environment. Some autistic individuals seem to achieve the same skill without training. Many of them, especially when they are young, interpret everything by intuition, by a system of sensing. It turns out that many non-autistic individuals are not skilled in nonverbal communication proper. Either they miss the leakage of nonverbal information that is sent unconsciously. In many cases, our facial expressions, postures, gestures, vocal intonation, and so forth are non-conscious. We do not notice what messages we are sending. The majority would not notice such subtle nonverbal clues as the way they sit or stand, how they look at someone, how they shape their mouths, and even the smell they give off, and will take what they are told on the surface level. How can we explain the ability of some autistic individuals to be in resonance with other people? For example, it is rare that I know what anyone is actually thinking, but concurrent emotions are very common. I can walk into a room and feel what everyone is feeling. The problem is that it all comes in faster than I can process it. There are these who say autistic people don't feel enough. We're saying exactly the opposite. They feel too much. The explanation might be in getting information via different channels rather than through conventional ones, gaze, facial expressions, etc. Thus, contrary to present stereotypes, they can experience strong positive emotional connectedness with objects, animals, and people. Some autistic individuals sense people and their inner emotions despite their communicative partners' attempt to hide them. And that's very confusing. Because on one level you get that message verbally, and on the other level you feel something completely different. Autistics are acutely aware of emotional projection due to not being able to filter out sensory input and monoprocessing of emotions, even if they cannot identify the exact emotion that is projected. Such individuals can be easily overwhelmed by and sometimes terrified of the signals and stimuli normal people are emitting and are unaware of. For example, Whatever the reason, I felt instantly unwell and sometimes terrified if I were face to face with a person or even a thing like a wall or a chair, because I had too much impact from the complexity of depth, movement, color, and smell from any human being. We send out more information than we realize. Many animals and some people can read these messages because they are written in nonverbal languages. The essence of any communication is to transmit or receive a representation of an experience. Having lost sensing, most people use the appear as foreground information, which is the left hemisphere dominance. To the sensory being, the be is the foreground regardless to the degree to which one is socially trained and pressured to respond to the appear. As though falsely it was the be. I used to go around unable to perceive the appear, which is the persona, because it was so background that only the be stood out, which is what you feel with your right hemisphere. You feel the room. You feel the person, regardless what they are trying to portray to you. It's just a persona. People with autism have their own means of non-verbal communication and find it much easier to understand and empathize with other autistic people who do share many similarities in the ways that they move, behave, and react to the world, which often makes sense to others with ASD, even though they may be utterly confused with anyone else. Yeah, you can feel it in another autistic, because it's different. The vibe is different. And it makes you feel comfortable, like coming home. Jill Bolte Taylor says, we are energy beings connected to one another through the consciousness of our right hemispheres, as one human family. And right here, right now, we are brothers and sisters on this planet, here to make the world a better place. And in this moment we are perfect, we are whole, and we are beautiful. The situation with political correctness and banning offensive words resembles a dangerous prediction made by George Orwell in his novel 1984, that shows an official language as one of the weapons to control the public by the authoritarian Big Brother government being newspeak, the official language of the country. This language not only dictated expression and therefore worldview, but also shaped the mental patterns and made all other modes of thought impossible. Words including justice, freedom, democracy, and honor were simply removed from the language, and the remaining ones were stripped of undesirable meanings. For example, the word free could not be used in its old meaning of politically or intellectually free, but was allowed in statements such as the dog is free from lice. We should not forget that language is arbitrary. It means we agree what words mean. If we believe the sky should be called red, the sky will be red for us. Belief alters experience. When we impose different and often negative meaning to neutral words. In effect, we influence perception and alter experience. We also make people think and behave differently. Tell someone 100 times that he is a pig, and he will go oink oink. I apologize to the pig and to anyone who would think that this might be applied to them. Research shows that verbal thought and visual thinking work via different brain systems. In general, research has shown that there is abnormal processing of verbal language in autism. For instance, they have investigated sentence comprehension in autism and found that, compared with controls, high-functioning autistic individuals exhibited lower levels of activation in Broca's area and higher levels of activation in Wernicke's area. They have suggested that there may be under-connectivity among cortical areas. In addition, neuroimaging research shows a tendency in autism to use visual spatial regions of the brain to compensate for higher-order cortical regions. To support these research findings, many papers refer to or quote Temple Grandin, whose insightful book Thinking in Pictures, and numerous articles describe visual thinking in detail. Some autistic individuals can and do detect stimuli to which normal individuals are blind, deaf, and so forth. Here are just a few examples. Some of the energy saver fluorescent light bulbs have such a high degree of flicker that some people on the spectrum feel like they are standing in the middle of a disco nightclub. I have an acute sense of color. I see rainbows in a piece of ice. Some colors and lights have sent me into manic and euphoric episodes of giggle fits. The sound sensitivity on some frequencies was so odd that I did not recognize it, because I felt it as vibration rather than as noise. The sensory being may use sensory-based, non-mental empathy through resonance in a relationship between sender and receiver, in which the receiver loses their own separateness in merging with the sender as part of the mechanism of acquaintance before returning to the unmerged state of its own entity. And that's why it is really very important with whom you mingle, or else you will feel drained and exhausted. And also the problem, you lose self because the other is like a distraction. If this person is not beneficial to you, it may cause a meltdown or sensory overload. You will feel it. Either a person creeps you out, exhausts you, or energizes you. It really depends on the person. And I think it also depends if they are extremely left hemisphere dominated. It is such a strain to be with them. If they tend to be rather right hemisphere dominated or very balanced, you will feel that, and it makes you feel so comfortable with them. It's such a difference. Those who share the sensory-based language understand each other perfectly well, irrespective of what cultures they were born in. Language and concepts within the system of sensing are repeated again and again by people devoid of interpretation, or in whom interpretation is an inconsistent and secondary system, who live on other sides of the earth, and have never met each other.
What is more? So what is normal? You know, our reaction is normal. And if someone can see a 60-cycle flickering of fluorescent lights, then their reactions will be normal, right? We just cannot see it, we don't understand it, so that's how I started. And then I researched language development and communication development and thinking, and all made sense, you know what I mean? If you perceive the world differently, you develop your thinking differently, you develop your language differently, and again, it is normal for autism. And that's how I've come up with this idea to write this book.
These researchers have put forward a hypothesis for autism which they call the intense world syndrome. According to their hypothesis, all features of autism, social interaction impairments, communication and language problems, cognitive functioning, repetitive behaviors, and so forth, are rooted in the sensory overload experienced by individuals with autism. Autistic people perceive, feel, and remember too much. Faced with a bombarding, confusing, baffling, and often painful environment, autistic infants withdraw into their own world by shutting down their sensory systems.
We're trying to move away from that clinical, sort of medicalised feel that often people experience whilst going through the diagnostic process. And we want you to feel that you can have a safe space where you can learn about your diagnosis in a non-clinical environment, so you're not initially, walking in with that deficit feel and feeling like you're at fault. We want to explain to you and you to feel that actually many of the difficulties in the community that you've experienced are not because of you, it's because people aren't making the adjustments that they should. And we are seeing numerous adults that really come to see us and use words like, I feel like a deficient neurotypical, which is just not what we want at all. We don't want you to feel like that with us. We want you to feel valued for who you are. So very much at all times, we keep autistic adults and their families at the heart of everything we do. And I wrote that into the core values and objectives right at the start. We explore innovative ways of working in partnership. And I know that sounds a bit trite when you read something like that, but all I can say is that on a personal level, as a carer of autistic children, the best services that I've ever had or my children have ever had are those that are willing to be flexible and to find a way to solve a solution, so very solution focused. In my experience, it is not autistic people that are rigid at all. It is neurotypicals who are determined to do things exactly the same way and won't budge. So
the concept of truth-seeing sunglasses is an interesting way to illustrate the importance of knowledge in one's worldview. Two people can be looking at the exact same thing, yet perceive two very different realities depending on the level of information and awareness possessed by each person. Nada's sunglasses can therefore represent one's knowledge of the truth, which allows a clear perception of reality. Upon learning the appalling truth about the world, Nada feels the need to share this vital information with his friend, Frank. Nada, however, quickly realizes that some people do not want to hear about the truth. In fact, many actually get angry and offended at the simple mention of something that alludes to it. When Nada asks Frank to put the sunglasses on so he can see what he sees, Frank firmly refuses and calls him a crazy mother. Nada replies with another classic line.
Either put on these glasses or start eating that trash can.
Followed by one of the longest one-on-one fight scenes I have ever seen in my life. a scene that is dragged out for so long that it becomes utterly absurd and even comical. While the scene maybe appears ridiculous, it says something about the difficulty of making regular average people wake up from their blissful ignorance. Frank finally sees the truth. All it took was Nada to beat the crap out of him, sticking the sunglasses on his face against his will and forcing him to look around. Yes, convincing other people of the truth can be a hard task.
And quite often, if somebody tells me no, I say, well, is there another way we can look at it? And this is what I mean about flexibility. So we have a very wide open door policy. If somebody needs support, they get it. And like I say, we're working flexibly, and wherever possibly, we want to try and take proactive measures to avoid crisis before it actually happens. The effort required to navigate through the world, and I think just sometimes it's good to bring it back to actually, what autistic people experience in their day-to-day life. And this is something that comes up time and time again. Many autistic individuals use their cognition to work out the unwritten social rules that govern interaction. So they are seeming to pull it off on the surface. You've got those individuals where it's obvious they're not pulling it off, but then you've got lots of individuals where on the surface they're seeming to, but they're doing it all top down. So they're doing it by cognition. It's requiring a lot of effort, a lot of thought. They're going through scripts in their head. They're constantly rehearsing what somebody might say and how they're going to respond. And on the surface, like I say, they're appearing to pull it off, but there's a cost. There's a massive cost, and it's that exhaustion. We see high levels of autistic burnout, and these are, very important factors at play here. Navigating the numerous unwritten social rules that govern interaction. Not to mention, that us neurotypicals, we don't say what we mean. We say we're just going to nip into a shop for 2 things and we come out with 40 or 50 things. We are quite confusing as individuals. So there's all of this to navigate all of the time. And it's not something that you find instinctive. It doesn't come naturally to you. You have to work really, really hard at it. So this can lead to an almost constant state of alertness and anxiety, leading to risk of mental and physical exhaustion. And I see, lots of adults sitting in my office and they're often quite pumped full of adrenaline, actually. They're really sort of on full mode all the time just to battle through the day and navigate through.
Here we see ourselves, not trapped within body, but coming through it like a vehicle for the self within and an extension of that self. Then, with fashion and other often illogical social learning, we begin to shape the expression not of who we are, but of who we think we should be, or wish we were, and so seal our paths as we move away from both true self and the life path that would have sprung from that self, which some call destiny. As we develop, expression, which should spring naturally, diminishes as it is sold out and replaced by stored movements, lines, voices, stored thoughts, wants, likes, and even thoughts about thoughts, which are often accessed so much more quickly than connected true expression. This can be especially compounded when true connected expression is blocked by anxiety, accessing problems, guilt, shame, denial, fear, and overwhelming sense of one's differentness, or the need for acceptance. Your suffering doesn't come from having an opinion. The suffering comes from not realizing that you are interpreting everything you experience. One of the signs of being a prisoner of the mind is constantly having to label things and determine whether they are true or not. We have all these true stories about who we are, what we can achieve, how our life is, how the world is, and how people treat us. We have all these stories, and yet we have no idea that we are prisoners of our own minds. We are constantly mistaking our subjective interpretations of the world as truth. Here, as we begin to construct false self, we become demigods, but we lose company with our first and most basic security, our sense of connected, real self. We begin to know inferiority and the possessiveness born of it. We begin to know emptiness and attempt to fill time or bury our heads in the sand. We begin to mistake control for caring, possession for self-worth, defensiveness for strength, dependence for love, submission for respect, and compulsion and obsession for like, want and choice. Here we find our politics and religion, our economics and other God replacements as we become part of society. In death, we again let go of body and return to no self, no other, in the great belonging of collective mergence of energies, no longer confined to the varied physical forms they clung to. In my end is my beginning, wrote T.S. Eliot. Others, deeply sensual and artistic, may feel it too unnatural to let go of this ultimate capacity to capture the experience as it. Although I gradually tasted later phases, I was still fully functioning in this earlier phase when I was in late childhood. Until I was about 7 or 8, I was still privately sure I could walk through walls or solid surfaces, perhaps because I had the experience from an earlier time. Recently, I was speaking to a man who had similar constant out-of-body experiences in childhood, who spoke about the confusion of whether he left with a body or without, and the occasional grip of panic at finding himself outside the physical body and afraid he may not be able to get back in. Ideally, people could use either system flexibly as required, even to test one against the other. Just one would test taste against smell to back up the perception of one with the other before trusting to eat. Instead, so many people lose the capacity to sense and then confuse the conscious interpretation of mind with the preconscious sensing of will. Many so-called psychics will constantly seek feedback and adjust what they claim to sense accordingly. Many are so tuned in to the conscious, to analysis and interpretation, that they cannot get out of mind enough to get into will. Anyone who worries or checks continually whether they are on the right track or not in what they claim to sense cannot have mind out of the picture enough to be able to tune into will with any consistency. Even the expression of what is sensed at the level of will comes out automatically without assessing, monitoring, or alternation. And most so-called psychics, even if able to tune into will, cannot tune mind out of the pre-conscious triggered expression of what has been sensed. The everything of nothing. Up to the age of 4, I sensed according to pattern and shifts in pattern. My ability to interpret what I saw was impaired, because I took each fragment in without understanding its meaning in the context of its surroundings. I'd see the nostril but lose the concept of the nose, see the nose but lose the face, see the fingernail but lose the finger. My ability to interpret from what I heard was equally impaired. I heard the intonation but lost the meaning of the words, got a few of the words but lost the sentences. I couldn't consistently process the meaning of my own body messages if I was focusing in on something with my eyes or ears. I didn't know myself in relation to other people because when I focused processing information about other, I lost self, and when I focused on self, I lost other. I could either express something in action or make some meaning of some of the information coming in, but not both at once. So, crossing the room to do something meant I'd probably lose the experience of walking even though my body did it. Speaking, I'd lose the meaning of my own sounds whilst moving. The deaf-blind may have lost their senses. I had my senses, but had lost the sense. I was meaning deaf, meaning blind. Interpretation and the realm of mind wasn't a reliable or consistent system for me. I remained reliant far longer than most people on an earlier system, the system of sensing. Even once interpretation got progressively online, better late and slow than never, I couldn't let go what I trusted and identified with. I can remember walking down the street even at age of 6 and sensing something which was about to happen, but then attempting to interpret the situation. I remember at that time that I turned from sensing and went with the odds of what I'd interpreted, and that it hadn't worked out. What I'd sensed had been right. I recall cursing myself for not trusting in sensing and attempting to use interpretation. Being trained out of sensing as people grow up, there's a huge pressure not to sense, but to use common sense, which is to use the system of interpretation. Both interpretation and sensing have equally their advantages and disadvantages. To lose one system is a tragedy to the worth, creativity and feeling of belonging this world might otherwise know. A place where fashion, hierarchy and prejudgment are not God's creations, but those of humans who have allowed these things to govern them. Had the system of sensing not become so globally redundant in adults, religion, the concepts of life and death, of physics and science, of language and of the social, would not be the black and white realities they are perceived to be. Now, unfortunately, we live in this world. But if we would allow the system of sensing equally into our world, it would look like this. Quote, before the invention of Christianity, our Paleolithic ancestors, the painters of the beautiful cave drawings in southern France about 35,000 years ago, were free to think of anything they might wish. The Ice Age hunters, who came into North America roughly 25,000 years ago, had equal freedom, and we share DNA linkage with them. We've inherited the right to intellectual freedom. Linkage needs only a trace of DNA, so we are bloodkin. We share a DNA smidgen with the mammoth hunters. We ought to be free, but we're not. Beginning about 2 million years ago, evolution gradually built our remarkable brain. Our environment during the evolution of the brain was the natural world, objective reality. Complex language, which is necessary to create abstract unreality, developed long afterwards. Consequently, our brain instinctively analyzes reality, but is easily seduced by abstract unreality. We didn't inherit an instinct for skepticism. Skepticism, like a second language, is an acquired trait that we have to learn. More to the point, we don't have an inbuilt filter to weed out abstract imagination. Aliens, angels, devils, dragons, fairies, goods, monsters, all these are real until we gear down into critical think mode and examine empirical evidence. All information that hits the brain, imaginary or real, is processed in the same way. First order consciousness doesn't differentiate between reality and unreality. Awareness is simply awareness. The only way to distinguish between the reality and unreality is to drop down a notch into thinking mode and filter the information with skepticism running. Abstract language has become our opiate. That's from the book Thought Control in America, Why We Act Like Idiots. As a kid, I used to be outside all the time, climbing trees, feeling connected. Having an imaginary Native American friend. We autistics are mostly right hemisphere sensory-based. We, unlike neurotypicals, never completely lose it. Even though the so-called high-functional autistics learn to adapt and become left hemisphere thinkers too. But it never becomes natural as it is for neurotypicals. Thus, as school trauma happened, suddenly being me, silent, not socializing, wasn't okay. My teachers thought this wasn't normal. Of course, one tries to fit in from this pressure. And so one moves to left hemisphere-based thinking and acting, losing that right hemisphere connection to some extent, and especially that connection to one's ancestors or imaginary friends gets lost. Back then, nobody knew anything about autism. I was born in 1974 and I went to school from 1980, that was kindergarten, and then so on until 1991. That's 11 years of indoctrination, basically. Being trained to behave as our Western culture wants us to behave. So of course you pretend to be normal, but what actually is normal, really? Just because you fail to truly adapt to the current westernized construct of left-brain thinking, you get diagnosed by those who are well adapted to the same construct, also known as being brainwashed, perhaps. So in order to get disability support as autistic, you need to pathologize yourself because you are not able to stand this construct we all live in for too long, while others do. Doesn't this seem a bit backwards? Because right now, to me, it seems the whole world is literally not in their right mind. It seems to me we, as Western culture especially, have completely lost the true way of being normal, also known as natural, like indigenous folk did. We, as Western culture, live in a cultural left hemisphere based cage and need to get back to our senses, right hemisphere, which will reconnect us with all that is. Indigenous people had that until they got force civilized. So, in order to get out of this, whatever this is, what's going on right now, behavior stemming from objective reality stabilizes society. So, here is where my biological curiosity takes over. There is zero survival value in belief without evidence. Imaginary reality is an oxymoron, an impossible concept. However, the cornerstone of biology reads that inherited traits which better enabled an organism to survive and reproduce have been preserved and carried forward into the present population. On the other hand, features and traits that hinder or fail to aid survival will be lost with time. Since inaccurate belief is dangerous, it shouldn't be prevalent in the population, but it is. So, we are faced with a strange anomaly. Obviously, tendencies to form unfounded belief are not products of biological evolution. But, as I stated before, the answer is simple. Unfounded belief became possible after the perfection of abstract language. You have to use abstraction to create unreality. What is scary is the fact that once fantasy is created in the consciousness, we don't naturally recognize it in other situations. Humanity literally owns unreality. No other species could afford it. Art is the ability to convey and, one hopes, affect others in that ability to convey. Art is the ability to capture a feeling, an experience, in a way that is more concise than words alone. It takes you inside the experience rather than speaking to you from outside it. It is an indirect language that addresses the senses as well as the mind. Art finds ways through doors blocked by mind. Any good book should have enough soul to contain some elements of art.